pretty close, mate. Take it.
Daryl's been giving us little insights, if you like, to the sorts of problems that he gets presented with as part of his job. So today he's going to continue with that theme. Thank you.
Correct. Thanks, Noel. So, as Norm indicated, my role as Motoring Interest Manager at RACV, more and more increasingly, although it was never written into my position description, involves requests from both the public, RACV members, and more increasingly staff within the RACV to assist in the identification of historic motor vehicles. And I say historic, but pretty much given the expertise that remains in the RACV when it comes to motor vehicles, that can read any vehicle, because you'd be fairly forgiven for understanding or thinking that the RACV doesn't have much to do with automobiles anymore. It's more of a hotel chain, but that's a whole different topic. So this is the third in a series of presentations detailing some of the methods and the resources that I have used to achieve successful identification or result of those vehicles. So, make sure I've got the right one here. So just as a quick recap, and particularly just to indicate to those who haven't seen my previous two presentations, Oiling the Wheels 1 and 2. In those presentations, we detailed the methods used to identify some of these following vehicles, and the images that come up are the actual images that are sent to me. Sometimes they're quite clear, sometimes they're incredibly obscure. So these are some successful identifications, and bear in mind that when I send the response back to individuals, it's not just a single line, it's usually 2 pages long as to why and how and where and when. So the 28 Chevrolet, the 1904 Mercedes, 2832 horsepower, a postcard that has a 1948 MGTC, which is still owned by the owner when that photograph was taken in 1956, and in the front a 1954 Sunbeam Alpine, 1903 Lacoste and Batman, taken from a postcard that everybody is aware of who's into Egyptology, taken at the Mena Hotel in Cairo, in front of the pyramids. Everyone was focused on the gentleman in the back seat, who was Howard Carter, and no one had ever asked what the vehicle actually was, but it's a 1903 Lacoste and Batman. The 1935 Hupmobile, that looks like it's actually a portrait photograph for advertising. The 1929 Essex Challenger. The 1940 Dodge Parlour car, which as a result of some of the processes that we used, we actually ended up finding the original vehicle. And the 1913 Crosley 15 horsepower. So this presentation is actually going to introduce another resource that is gradually taking shape and opening up some new possibilities, particularly in unearthing the stories behind some of Victoria's earliest vehicles. This photograph came to me from a regional historical society. Someone had suggested to them, send it to the guy at the RACV. His specialty area is veteran vehicles. They did, on the basis that the Historical Society had been contracted by a local family to put together the family history, that history being of the local Cowan family. One of the assets that the family was able to provide to the Historical Society was this fantastic image of which they were extremely proud. And in a little bit of a segue from some of yesterday's presentations, in this case, family law had it that this is the Cowan family and a few friends, all identified, all dressed in their Sunday best, posing with the new family car. But first things first, they wanted to know what the vehicle was. It's a 1910 Overland. The simple identification for that was the flat part on the top of the bonnet, immediately identifies it as an overland. Most vehicles of the era had simple peak bonnets, but the flat bonnet is very characteristic of overlands, and it was subsequently confirmed to be exactly that. The initial reaction was to go back to the people who'd made the inquiry with the basic information that was requested. Unfortunately, as it tends to do, curiosity got the better of me. So at this point, what I want you to know is the registration plate on the front that looks like 19321. It's not, it's 3921, and that will become important later on in the song. Oh, wrong way. In Victoria, the Motor Car Act, requiring all vehicles to be registered and all drivers to be licensed, came into being in late 1909. The first registrations, however, weren't issued until January 1910. Very fortunately, I have access to some fantastic publications, including this incredibly scarce one. A few of them are known to exist. This is the 1912 Automobile Directory of Victoria. Within it is listed the name, the registration number, the name and address of every registered vehicle in Victoria to the end of 1911. And I'll point out there is a second section in the book that reorders all of those and lists everybody by name. It's a fantastic resource. Personally, being aware that both South Australia and New South Wales have their early registrations online, both through family history sites, I decided that it would be a noble project for me to take on to digitise the early Victorian records with the intention, eventually, of making them freely available online. I have a personal hate of people who have access to historical data that won't share it. I'm sorry, you might be one of them. It just drives me insane. So this is what it actually looks like. This is the digitised first few entries. I'm up to about 2,500 at the moment. Process has started and it's opening up a whole new world of information. Not so much the actual vehicles, but more about the people and the social history behind. Oh, actually, I'll go back there. You notice that numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 were originally registered or issued in Victoria to state government departments. The first vehicle registered in Victoria to the public is registration number 7. So even though number 1 exists, it's on a Mercedes, it's not as important as registration number 7, which is also on an older Mercedes. The gentleman who owns that number plate on a number of occasions, going back even a few years, has been offered 7 figures for the number plate. He's not remotely interested in actually selling it, in case you've got the spare $1.5 million. So back to the Cowans and registration number 3921. Records show, these records actually show that 3921 was actually registered to Mr. Michael Queerly McNamara, a local Benalla auctioneer and estate agent. He owned the vehicle until early 1912, when he parted with it, obviously in exchange or part exchange for a new vehicle, to the Sunshine Motor Company of Collins Street, Melbourne, and then by November 1912 it was back up on the river, the river now owned by Mr. R.E. Beer of Echuca. The Cowan family, proudly claiming this fantastic photograph to be their one and only, or their pride possession, are not actually listed in any available records as actually owning a motor vehicle before the First World War. The much loved photograph of the family and their first car is in fact a creation of family law. 3 generations of the family have gone through proudly displaying this to anyone who is prepared to actually listen, that this is the family in their Sunday best posing with their first car. In fact, they're posing with the car of the estate agent who in 1912, sold the family farm at a mortgagee's sale. It wasn't quite the answer that they were expecting, but at least I abrogated the responsibility of telling the family and let the Historical Society do that. So this takes us on to how these records have become important in creating not just the story of the story of the vehicle, but the story that surrounds the car, which I can guarantee, particularly prior to 1910, for those vehicles, are absolutely fascinating. Prior to 1910, you had to be someone to actually be able to own a motor vehicle. I've recently discovered another resource, as recently as a week ago, to find out that of the first 100 registration numbers in Victoria, 12 of them were actually issued to old Scotch college students. So we're actually now putting together some fantastic stories about some of these early registration numbers. The difference between the Victorian registrations and the South Australia and New South Wales ones that are available is unfortunately that they don't include the make of vehicle. In order to add context to the database under construction, I've been looking for images of the era that clearly show both the vehicle and the registration number, and hopefully contain some details of the owner, so we can actually start matching vehicles with registration numbers. So within the database you can click on the number and up will come a picture of the car. The Singer. This is a really well-known photograph, one of many held in the State Library of Victoria. It's a Darge image. Algernon Darge was a prolific photographer. When he passed away, many of the images he created were distributed, most of the military ones going to the War Memorial, but many of the others going to the Argus newspaper. After the Argus ceased to be in 1956, they were acquired, those glass negatives were acquired by James Flood. And in '68, this image was first reproduced in the first James Flood book of early motoring. It was edited by Harold Painting. Harold Painting eventually gifted that collection of glass plate negatives to the State Library of Victoria in 1995. The image is actually labelled a motoring party in a 1907 Singer car. It is definitely a 1907 Singer. There were only two vehicles that I'm aware of that actually had the big Randell on the front. One of them was a 1907 Singer, and the other are the Tarrants that were built here in Melbourne. It's 9 horsepower, twin cylinder. The image on the State Library of Victoria is dated at 1907, obviously because of the car, but it can't be. The image cannot be prior to January 1910. The description reads, two women seated beside the male driver, both have motoring veils tied over their hats. The registration number of the car is 1308. There are a couple of things wrong with that. Firstly, and most importantly, the number at the front is not 1301, it is in fact 1801, and without that number, there is no story attached. So this is a condensed version of the life of Herbert Farrow, Singer owner and motoring rascal. It was originally presented by both Fiona and I at the Singer National Rally in Ballarat earlier this year. We know this is Herbert, as is shown by the transcribed entry for Victorian registration number 1801. Now that's it, already transcribed and in the database under construction. There he is, living at York Terrace, St Kilda Road, Melbourne. Herbert Edward Farrow, or Bert, was born in Sebastopol, Ballarat in 1875, the youngest of 12 children. His parents were married in 1853, moved to Ballarat in 1854, the year of the Eureka Stockade. that is Sebastopol Street. Albert Street in Sebastopol. This is William Farrow, Bert's brother. By the time Bert is 15, the family have moved into Carlton, where his father dies. When Bert is 18, his older brother is sentenced to 6 months hard labour for stealing shoes from his employer. In 1895, Bert is working as a printer in Fitzroy. The same year, along with his older brother Benjamin, is involved in an altercation in Smith Street, outside a butcher's shop, as a result of which the other two youths are charged with assault. And unfortunately, this is really the beginning. This is the beginning to set out the circumstances of Bert's future. In 1897, at the age of 22, he marries Ada Clancy, but by 1900, his new printing business is declared insolvent with debts of £74 and assets of £6. In 2006, Bert and Ada have a daughter, also named Ada. Unfortunately, February 1906, Bert's wife Ada dies of heart failure. By May 1906, his debts from 1900 are discharged, but then his baby daughter, in August, who's been in the care of his in-laws since the death of his wife, also dies. In 1907, Bert seems to have got over things a little bit, and he's purchased his Singer motor vehicle and enters it in the sealed bonnet reliability contest organised by the then Automobile Club of Victoria. This is a list of the entries with Bert at number 7. And interesting here is to note some of those names who were entered in the sealed bonnet contest. Some luminaries in Victorian motoring such as Grimway, Tarrant, Callow, Staunton and Manifold, names that are reproduced in many cases on street names around Melbourne. Note also, down the bottom there, Staunton, and there is another one, and Curry, are two Rolls Royces. The Rolls Royce 4050 wasn't actually made available to the public until 1907. These are two of the very early silver ghosts that actually came out to Australia, and I am reliably informed, as a result of the last presentation I did of this, that the Staunton vehicle still exists and has been restored and still remains in Australia. The sealed bonnet contest was held in Victoria, December 1907, ran over 3 days from Melbourne to Camperdown, back to Ballarat, and then back to the finish at the Haymarket in Melbourne, which is at the end of Elizabeth Street, where the tyre store is on the left-hand side. 31 vehicles started, 29 finished, and 21 of those did so without loss of points, including Herbert in his Singer. Competitors started each day with 100 points and lost points during the run for transgressions such as breaking the seal on the bonnet, arriving late, or bending an axle, breaking a spring, or just arriving outside the time limits. Cars were divided into different classes based on the number of cylinders. Herbert was one of the gold medal recipients. A leader newspaper described this event as a most enjoyable one, whilst the test afforded further evidence of how reliable the present day car has become. Continuing with our story of the motoring rascal, one evening in February 1908, Bert is driving his Singer down along Glenferrie Road, collides with a telegraph post and is thrown clear from his car. Fortunately, he's not seriously hurt. His misfortune continues. In July of the same year, 1908, he's fined 40 shillings after having driven on the wrong side of the road, colliding with a truck. The truck driver gives evidence that he thought Bert was drunk because his motor car was wobbling from side to side. However, a doctor called to give evidence states that though the defendant was excited, he was not under the influence of alcohol. Trust me, I'm a doctor.
Is that a motor-powered truck or
wasn't actually state. Do you remember Fiona? It was actually described as a truck, so perhaps it actually was. 1908, okay, 1908 fortunately finishes on a high note for Bert, because on Christmas Eve he marries for the second time to Miss Lucy Ann Groves, who is known as Netta. So, as previously described, in late 1909 the Victorian Motor Car Act came into place, requiring all motor vehicles to be registered and drivers to be licensed. Bert registered his Singer, number 1801, in the first quarter of 1910. But by 1911, Bert has actually moved the car on and now has a new vehicle registered, number 3864. We're not sure what that motor vehicle is, but I'm sure more research will eventually unearth it. The same month, Bert is charged with driving his new motor car without a rear light. In May 1911, Bert is charged, with the rear light. The offence this time occurs at night. That's the second offence. 2 offences. In January, he's charged with driving without a rear light. He gets away with it. But in May 1911, he's again charged with driving his new motor car without a rear light. This time, it's at night, he's not forgiven, and he's fined 20 shillings plus 6 shillings cost. The same month, Bert is charged with parking his motor car in Swanston Street in such a position as to obstruct other vehicles. In 1912, it was a quiet year for Bert, and we don't hear anything more about Bert and his misfortunes with the motor cars until the night of Thursday, the 25th of September 1913. Bert was driving the motor car, the new motor car, not the Singer, which collided with an electric light post at the intersection of Little Collins and Spring Streets. As a result of this accident, Bert was thrown from the car and was killed. He was 37 years of age. There were 2 passengers, however, in the car with Bert at the time of the accident. Joseph Meredith, a dentist, and quite scandalously, and adding to Bert's rascal reputation, a married woman, Mrs. Dorothy Michael. Following the crash, the dentist quit the scene, not presenting himself to the police until the following morning, claiming he had no memory of having gotten home. Mrs. Michael received some minor injuries. At the inquest into Bert's death, Mrs. Michael advised that she had been living apart from her husband. Oddly enough, a divorce was shortly granted. At the inquest, evidence was also given by a witness to the accident, Mr. John Triggs, who just happens to be our Fiona's 3rd grade uncle, just showing that within historic motoring circles there is no such thing as 6 degrees of separation, there's usually 1. His death is ruled accidental, the coroner recording that it was an extraordinary thing that these 3 persons should all have been crowded on the front seat at the time. It did not leave the driver proper room to control his wheel. Not the least of which most probably is the fact he had his hands somewhere else. Herbert Farrow, Bert, left his entire estate of £4,200 to his wife. She'd never remarried. Instead, she travelled extensively and settled in Honolulu. Bert is buried in the Brighton General Cemetery here in Melbourne. So this has just gone to show that there's more to historic motoring than just the cars. And from time to time we do unearth new resources that are quickly becoming available to the general researcher. The learnings are exactly these. Sometimes it's not just about the actual image. There are always other resources. You just have to, you just may not have found them yet. And as I said, this has come to the fore in the last week for me, when in general discussions, we've all of a sudden got access to the archives of Scotch College. And most surprisingly, I was approached by the Public Records Office here in Victoria, indicating that whilst they don't have a lot of information about sales and receipts, they do have a lot of those early motor company records, particularly the records of the annual general meetings, which when you were a relatively low volume producer or seller, or if you were a bodybuilder, or if you were in the infancy of motoring in Victoria, you generally proudly recorded your achievements in your annual general meeting minutes. Always think obliquely. If you don't just stick to the one idea rigidly, spread your wings a bit, ask some silly questions, you get a few silly answers back, but every now and then you hit upon an absolute gem. And this is a perfect example of where a picture can definitely be worth 1,000 words. So in finalising, I usually finish with the statement that is well known, that knowledge may very well be power, but it's the passing on of knowledge that is far more powerful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daryl, again for another enlightening tour through somebody's past. We've got some questions for Daryl.
Daryl, just a point, I think you missed the photograph of the singer. You said the date was wrong. Now, if I heard you correctly, was it 1910 they brought in the registrations?
Yes.
And when did they first apply plates?
1910.
So that photograph couldn't have been taken in 1907. Is that the point you meant?
That's exactly the point. The actual statement on the State Library of Victoria states that the image is from 1907, which it cannot be.
You tried to get them to change the information.
I've tried a few times. Yeah, obviously you've had the same problems that I have. God help us.
But they usually have a little, well, my library has a little clause on the bottom of their website that says, if you see something that you can add or change to the caption of this image, please let us know.
Yeah,
They seem
likewise.
to regard the information that comes with their acquisition as more sacrosanct than the knowledge from knowledgeable researchers.
I get that absolute distinct impression that it's a little bit like the silver arrows, white or whatever, silver. So once it's cast in stone and once it's printed, God help us, it becomes the truth. Yeah. That's it.
Anyone else?
Daryl, do you try to identify the location of photographs of cars?
In
Like
fact,
the York Terrace house is built in 1889, thereabouts, with the fence.
yeah, there you go.
If it's a Melbourne place, you can find it on the Board of Works detail.
There you go. That's exactly what I mentioned about all these surprising sources that become available. I don't usually do that. Sometimes some of the images are identified, but certainly Helen, who until recently was an employee of the RACV, in her capacity as an architectural historian, has often been able to shed light on those sorts of things for me. Any other questions? Thank you very much.